She was 34 years old and she owned nothing but the clothes on her back and $9 folded into her glove when the county auctioneer's gavel came down. It was her husband's brother, Cornelius Pratt, who put her out of the only home she had ever kept, standing in the doorway with the deed in his hand and telling her, without meeting her eyes, that a widow with no children and no proof of her claim had no business on land that could pay a dead man's debts. All she had left in the world was that folded handful of dollars and a grandmother's thimble sewn into her hem. So when the auctioneer came to the last parcel of the day, 90 acres of gully and scrub that folks in Larkspur Hollow had called Calder's Ravine for longer than anyone could say why, a place where, half buried in red clay and creeper vine, sat the rusted skeleton of a railroad car that had not moved an inch in 90 years, she raised her hand and bought it for $9, and the men behind her laughed. They thought her desperate. They thought her foolish. They did not know that sealed inside that forgotten car, untouched since the year it left the rails, was a truth that would clear a dead man's name, unmake a fortune built on lies, and give a dying town back its own heart. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Calder Rourke. If you are watching this from a place that people have written off as worthless, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd like to know. Eleanor had been born Eleanor Calder in the spring of 1869, in a two-room cabin at the edge of Larkspur Hollow, Montana Territory, in a valley so narrow that the sun did not reach the creek bed until nearly 10 in the morning, and left it again by 4. Her mother, Ruth Calder, was a seamstress with hands so quick and sure that women rode 2 days from Bannock to have her fit a wedding dress, and it was from her mother that Eleanor learned the patience of small, careful work, how a seam done wrong could be picked out and done again, how nothing was ever so ruined that it could not be salvaged if you had the will to sit with it long enough. Her father she barely remembered. Amos Calder had died in a mining accident when she was 6, and what she knew of him came secondhand through her grandmother, a stern and upright woman named Prudence Calder who had raised 3 sons and outlived every one of them, and who told Eleanor more times than she could count, sitting by the stove with her knitting needles clicking like a slow clock, that in this life there is no such thing as a thing with no value, there is only a thing nobody has yet looked at twice. It was Prudence who told her about Ezra. Ezra Calder had been Prudence's husband's younger brother, a wiry, quick-eyed young man who had gone to work as a brakeman on the spur line that the Larkspur Mining Company had run up through the hills in the years just after the war, hauling ore and twice a month, the payroll strongbox that paid 400 miners their wages. Ezra was, by every account Eleanor ever heard, an honest man, the kind who would walk 2 miles back down a trail to return a dropped coin. And in the autumn of 1814, 90 years before Eleanor would ever stand in that ravine with an auctioneer's paper in her hand, the payroll car Ezra Calder was riding had gone missing in the night, along with $11,000 in gold coin, and though almost no one remembered this detail anymore, the original charter papers granting 300 acres of common land to the town itself, land meant for a schoolhouse, a church, a burying ground held in trust for the people of Larkspur Hollow and no one else. Ezra Calder was blamed. He vanished before he could be tried, and the town decided, in the easy and merciless way that towns decide such things, that he had run off with the gold and the town's own land papers besides, and that the Calders were, from that day on, a family not quite to be trusted. Prudence never believed it. She told Eleanor so, again and again, in that low fierce voice she used for the truths she meant to be remembered. Ezra would no more have stolen from those miners than he would have stolen from his own mother, she said. Something else happened to him. Something the town was too lazy or too frightened, or too satisfied with its own story to look at twice. And then Prudence would go quiet, because there was nowhere else for the thought to go, no thread left to pull, and the world had long since moved on from caring. Eleanor grew up carrying 2 things from her grandmother, a needle-quick patience for salvaging what others discarded, and an old, unhealed ache for a great-uncle she had never met, a man whose name had become a quiet shame in her family's mouth even as her grandmother insisted, stubbornly, that shame was not the same as guilt. She grew up, too, in the shadow of the ravine itself, which the older children dared each other to enter and which the grown folk crossed themselves near, half joking, calling it cursed ground, though none of them could have said with any confidence what exactly had happened there, only that something had, and that a Calder was at the center of it. Eleanor herself went there only once as a girl, sent by her grandmother on some errand of blackberries that grew wild along its lip, and she remembered standing at the edge looking down at the long rusted shape of a railroad car half swallowed by clay and vine, thinking it looked like some great sleeping animal and feeling, for reasons she could not have named, that it was watching her back. She married Thomas Rourke in 1889, the year Montana became a state, and for 14 years they kept a modest freight and dry goods operation on the north side of town, Thomas driving the wagon routes up into the hill camps and Eleanor keeping the books, and keeping them well. She had, it turned out, an unusual gift for numbers, for finding the one line in a ledger that did not add up, for noticing when a supplier's invoice had been quietly padded by $1 here, $2 there. It was steady, unremarkable work, and she loved it, loved the small triumph of a column that balanced clean, loved Thomas's tired, grateful face at the end of a long haul, loved the modest house they kept with its one good window that caught the morning light. They had no children, a private grief they did not often speak of, and Eleanor sometimes thought that this was why Thomas's brother Cornelius, older and colder and always faintly resentful of the life Thomas had built without him, looked at her the way he did, as though she were a guest in a house she had no true right to. The fall came fast, the way it so often does, arriving first as a single stone and then as a slide. In the January of 1903, an influenza swept up through the hill camps and down into Larkspur Hollow, and it took Thomas in 11 days, leaving Eleanor a widow at 34 with a freight business, a modest house, and, as she would soon learn, considerably more debt than either of them had ever let on to the other. Thomas had borrowed against the business twice in the last 2 years to keep it afloat through a bad stretch, and the note, it turned out, had been co-signed by his brother Cornelius, a detail Eleanor had never been told and could not now prove she hadn't known. Within a month of the burial, Cornelius came to her with papers already drawn, explaining, in the reasonable, regretful voice of a man who has already decided what he is going to do, that the business and the house both stood as collateral against Thomas's debts, that as co-signer he had every right to call the note, and that a widow with no children and, he did not say this part outright, but he let it hang in the air between them, no particular reputation of her own to lean on, could hardly expect the bank or the town decide against him. It was not only Cornelius. It was the whisper that ran quick and quiet through Larkspur Hollow once people learned that the widow left with nothing was a Calder by birth, the granddaughter, some remembered, of that brakeman who ran off with the payroll gold 90 years back. Wasn't she, or was it his brother? Nobody was quite sure of the particulars anymore, only that there was a stain there, old and faded but never fully washed, and that it seemed, to more than a few of the town's more comfortable citizens, like a small and satisfying confirmation of something they had always half suspected about Calder blood. Eleanor heard it in church, in the dry goods store, in the careful way old friends of her mother's now crossed the street to avoid a conversation that might require kindness they weren't prepared to spend. She held her chin up through all of it, the way her grandmother had taught her, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like begging, and Prudence Calder had raised her granddaughter never to beg. By March, the house was gone, sold to cover the note, with barely enough left over, once the bank and Cornelius's lawyer had taken their share, to leave Eleanor with $41 to her name, $41 that dwindled, through the slow bleeding expense of boarding house rent and a town that offered a widow of her name very little honest work, to $9 by the time the county held its spring tax auction of forfeited and abandoned parcels, a dreary annual ritual held on the courthouse steps where the town's least wanted land went for whatever the desperate or the foolish were willing to pay. She had gone that morning meaning only to watch the way a person picks at a wound. But when the auctioneer, a red-faced man named Purdy who clearly wanted the whole business over before lunch, called out the last lot of the day, 90 acres, unimproved, known locally as Calder's Ravine, containing one derelict rail car of no salvage value, sold as is, minimum bid $1, something in Eleanor went very still. It was, she would say later, less a decision than a recognition, as though some part of her had been waiting her whole life for that particular sentence to be spoken aloud. She raised her hand. Nobody else did. The gavel came down on $9, her whole remaining fortune, and Purdy handed her the deed with the faint, indulgent smile men reserve for women they've decided are not quite in their right minds, and told her, not unkindly, that she'd gotten exactly what she paid for. She walked the 6 miles out to the ravine that same afternoon rather than spend a cent on a wagon, and she stood at its lip the way she had stood there once as a girl sent for blackberries, and looked down at the long dark shape still half buried in the clay after all these years, and felt, instead of the foolishness the town assumed she must be feeling, something closer to a held breath finally released. The car itself had settled deep into the ravine's slope, its undercarriage long since sunk into red clay and its wooden sides silvered and split by 90 years of Montana weather, so that at first glance it looked less like a train car than like some great fallen tree, hollow and gray, wearing a coat of creeper vines so thick it had to be peeled back like a curtain before Eleanor could even find the door. It took her the better part of 2 days working alone with a crowbar borrowed on credit from the hardware man, a soft-spoken widower named Mr. Ostrander who did not ask why a Calder woman wanted a crowbar and who, when he learned what she'd bought, only said quietly that his own father had always sworn the town got the story of that ravine wrong and left it there. The outer door had rusted into its frame, and when it finally gave way with a shriek that sent a pair of nesting swallows startling up into the gray sky, the smell that came out to meet her was not what she expected. Not rot, not must, but something drier and stranger, like old paper and cold iron, the smell, she would think later, of time itself sealed up and left to wait. Inside, the car was mostly empty, stripped long ago by scavengers of anything easily carried, but wedged behind a fallen support beam, tucked into a shadowed corner that a careless search would have missed entirely, Eleanor's lantern light caught the dull gleam of brass. It was a brakeman's lantern, the glass long shattered, but the brass housing intact and scratched into its base, worn nearly smooth by 90 years of handling before it ever came to rest here, were 2 letters, EC. She sat down right there on the floor of that ruined car, in the settling dust and the cold autumn light coming through the broken door, and she held that lantern in both hands and wept, not for the $9, not for the house or the husband or the town's whispers, but for a great-uncle she had never met, whose initials she was holding in her 2 hands in the exact place the town had always sworn, without ever once looking, that he'd stolen from. It took her 3 more days of careful, patient work to understand that the car was not what it appeared to be. She noticed at first the way she noticed a column in a ledger that would not balance. A discrepancy in the numbers, except here the numbers were feet and inches, the outer wall of the car measured against the inner one, a gap of nearly 10 inches that no ordinary freight car construction could account for. She had spent 14 years learning to trust that particular itch at the back of her mind, the one that said something does not add up here, and so she spent a full day running her palms along the car's inner wall, pressing, listening for the hollow answer of empty space behind old wood, until at the car's far end, behind a panel that had been fitted with a craftsman's care no ordinary freight builder would have bothered with, her fingers found a seam. It took her the crowbar, a chisel, and most of an afternoon's strength to work that panel free, and when it finally came away in a shower of dust and dry rot, what lay behind it made her sit back on her heels and go very still for a long moment before she trusted herself to reach inside. There was a strong box, iron-banded and padlocked, small enough to carry but heavy enough that she had to drag rather than lift it. There was an oilcloth bundle, tied with waxed cord that had gone brittle but held, and inside it, astonishingly dry and legible after 90 years in that sealed dark space, a ledger bound in leather and a single folded letter, the ink faded to the color of weak tea but the hand still steady and clear. And there was a rolled document, tied separately and sealed with wax bearing the pressed stamp of the Territorial Land Office, which Eleanor did not yet dare to open, because some instinct told her it mattered too much to rush. She read the letter first, there in the failing light, by her lantern's small flame, and the voice that rose up off that 90-year-old page was so plainly, achingly her own family's voice, that same stubborn careful honesty her grandmother had always sworn to her, that she felt the whole shape of her own life quietly rearrange itself around what she was reading. Ezra Calder had written it in the last days before he disappeared, addressed to no one in particular, as though he had known he might not live to deliver it and had wanted at least, for the truth to exist somewhere in his own hand. He wrote that he had discovered, in the course of his ordinary duties checking freight manifests against the mine company's books, that the payroll figures did not match the ore shipments, that money was being skimmed, week over week, in amounts too small for any one person to notice but too large, over years, to be anything but deliberate. He had taken his suspicions, cautiously, to the one man he trusted above the mine's own management, Augustus Vane, the line's paymaster and the company's most trusted officer, a man of considerable standing in Larkspur Hollow, whose family Ezra noted with the plain, unadorned honesty of a man recording facts rather than accusations, had grown remarkably prosperous in a remarkably short span of years. It was Augustus Vane, the letter made clear in Ezra's careful hand, who had orchestrated the theft, not of $11,000 in gold coin, which had never actually been stolen at all, but sat, every last piece of it, in the strong box at Eleanor's knee, but of something far more valuable and far less likely to ever be missed. The Territorial Land Office charter granting 300 acres of common land to the town of Larkspur Hollow in perpetual public trust. Vane had learned that a clerical oversight meant no copy of that charter existed anywhere but the one traveling in his own paymaster's car, and he had seen in that oversight an opportunity. If the original charter simply vanished, the common land it protected, land meant for a school, a church, a cemetery, land that could never otherwise be bought or sold, would revert, after a period of unclaimed dormancy, to whoever could establish the strongest competing claim. Augustus Vane had spent the following 90 years and his descendants after him, quietly and patiently establishing exactly that claim, acre by acre, deed by deed, until the town's own commons had become the private holdings of the Vane family, and nobody left alive remembered it had ever been anything else. Ezra had confronted him. Vane, rather than risk exposure, had staged the robbery, hiding the actual gold which he had no real use for and which would only invite scrutiny, and instead framing Ezra Calder as the thief who had made off with both the coin and the town's own charter, knowing that a brakeman's word would never outweigh a paymaster's. Ezra, in the letter's final lines, wrote that he intended to save what he could, driving the payroll car off the Spurs' disused siding into the ravine under cover of night, sealing the true gold and, more crucially, the original charter behind a false wall of his own careful construction, intending to return with proof once he could reach the territorial marshal in Helena. He signed the letter with what Eleanor would later think was almost unbearable steadiness for a man who must have known, even as he wrote it, how great a risk he was taking. He was never heard from again. Whether Augustus Vane had him killed, or whether Ezra simply vanished into the hills rather than face a trial rigged against him from the start, no record Eleanor would ever find could say for certain. But the strongbox was full. The charter, when she finally worked up the courage to break its 90-year-old seal, was intact, its language plain and unmistakable. 300 acres held in perpetual public trust for the town of Larkspur Hollow, signed and stamped by the Territorial Land Office in the year 1811. She sat in that ruined car until well past dark, the lantern guttering low, her grandmother's voice in her ears. There is no such thing as a thing with no value, only a thing nobody has yet looked at twice, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she was holding not merely her family's vindication but the whole town's stolen heart, and that she had absolutely no idea, yet, how a woman with $9 and no standing was meant to give either one back. Word does not stay quiet long in a town the size of Larkspur Hollow, and within a fortnight of Eleanor's discovery, enough of it had leaked, through Mr. Ostrander, through the county clerk she'd had to consult about the land charter's standing, through her own guarded but unmistakable change in bearing, that Silas Vane, Augustus's grandson and the current president of the Larkspur Hollow Trust Bank, the largest landholder in 3 counties and a man whose family had sat comfortably atop this town for 3 generations, came calling on Eleanor himself, driving out to the ravine in a fine black buggy that looked entirely wrong against the scrub and clay. He was, at first, courteous in the particular way of men accustomed to getting what they want through courtesy alone. He offered to buy the ravine parcel back from her at a generous price, 20 times what she had paid, framing it as a kindness to a widow sitting on worthless land that surely held nothing but old iron and false hope. When Eleanor evenly declined, his courtesy thinned by degrees, until he was speaking plainly of the trouble a woman of her family's reputation might find herself in should she go about town making wild claims she could not substantiate, claims that, he pointed out, not incorrectly, rested on the unwitnessed word of a man 90 years dead, against the standing of a family that had built half the town's prosperity with its own 2 hands. Cornelius Pratt, when he heard the rumors, came too, though not out of any loyalty to Eleanor. He came, she understood at once, because Silas Vane held the note on Cornelius's own considerable debts, and a word from Vane could ruin him as easily as Vane's grandfather had ruined Ezra. Cornelius stood in the ravine's mouth and told her, in the same reasonable regretful voice he'd used to take her house, that she would be wise to sell the land, take Vane's generous offer, and let a 90-year-old grudge lie quiet where it had always lain. But it was not only the powerful who came to her that autumn. It was Mr. Ostrander, who brought her a crate of provisions and refused payment, saying only that his father would have wanted to see this through. It was old widow Fenwick, whose own family had lost a strip of pastureland to a Vane land claim 2 decades back under circumstances she'd never fully trusted, who walked the 6 miles out herself to sit with Eleanor an afternoon and tell her, quietly, that she believed her. It was, slowly, a handful of others, a blacksmith, a schoolteacher, a young circuit-riding preacher new enough to town to have no old debts of gratitude to the Vane name, who began in low voices to ask each other whether it wasn't time somebody looked twice at a story the town had simply agreed 90 years ago not to examine. Eleanor understood, turning the charter over and over in her careful hands through those tense weeks, that Silas Vane's threats and his father's grandfather's crime were, in the end, the same instrument played twice, the confident assumption that no one would ever look closely enough or care enough or dare enough to check. She had spent 14 years finding the one line in a ledger that didn't add up. She was not about to stop now for the sake of being told, politely, to look away. She went, in the last week of October, to the county courthouse and asked, as was, she had confirmed with painstaking care, entirely her legal right as the parcel's owner and the document's finder, that the recovered charter be formally presented before the visiting circuit judge, Judge Harlan Boyce, who rode through Larkspur Hollow twice a year to hear the cases too large for the town's own magistrate. She asked, too, that the ledger and Ezra Calder's letter be entered alongside it, not as proof beyond dispute, She was too honest a bookkeeper to pretend 90-year-old paper alone could hang a man. But as the thread that, once pulled, revealed just how much of the Vane family's holdings traced back, deed by careful deed, to land that had never rightfully been theirs to sell in the first place. The hearing was held in December, in a courthouse packed tighter than Eleanor had ever seen it, half the town come to watch a Calder either vindicated or ruined for good, and Silas Vane's lawyers arguing, with real skill, that a letter and a ledger from a man long dead proved nothing but a family's old grievance dressed up as history. It was the charter itself that turned the room, the Territorial Land Office's own seal, verified against county records that very weak by a clerk with no reason to favor either side, showing beyond any lawyer's clever argument that 300 acres currently held under 6 different Vane family deeds had, in 1811, been granted in perpetual public trust to the town and never lawfully transferred since. Judge Boyce, a dry, unhurried man not given to speeches, spent 3 days reviewing the county's own land records before ruling that the disputed acreage, including the ground under the Vane Bank's own handsome brick building, a detail that brought a low ripple of astonished laughter through the courtroom, reverted, as the 90-year-old charter required, to the town of Larkspur Hollow itself, to be held once more in trust for its people. Silas Vane did not go to prison. The crime, if crime it could still be called after 90 years and 2 dead generations, belonged more truly to his grandfather than to him, and Eleanor, when asked whether she wished to pursue him further, found she had no taste for that kind of justice. What she wanted, and what she got, was quieter and in its way more complete. Vane's fortune, built so long on land that was never his, unwound itself in the space of a single winter, deed by deed, as the town reclaimed what had been stolen from it, and the bank that had held Larkspur Hollow's debts in its fist for 3 generations found itself, almost overnight, holding considerably less leverage than it once had. Silas Vane sold his remaining interest within the year and left for Butte, and Cornelius Pratt, whose debts to that same bank could no longer be quietly protected by a powerful friend, found himself facing his own creditors with no one left to hide behind. A reckoning Eleanor did not orchestrate and took no pleasure in, but did not mourn either. As for the true payroll gold, sealed untouched in that strongbox for 90 years, Eleanor did precisely what her grandmother would have expected of her and nothing that Silas Vane, in his courteous opening offer, could ever have predicted. She did not keep it. She placed it, publicly and before Judge Boyce's own witnessing signature, into a trust for the reclaimed common land, enough to build, at last, the schoolhouse the original charter had promised 90 years before, enough to repair the church roof that had leaked through 2 generations of collection plates too thin to fix it, enough to set aside a proper burying ground with a headstone, finally, for a brakeman named Ezra Calder, whose body was never found but whose name, carved into granite, on a spring morning in 1904, was cleared before the whole town in a ceremony Eleanor herself insisted be held not with mourning but with something closer to gratitude. She kept, for herself, only the ravine and the rusted car within it, which she had hauled out piece by piece that following summer not to sell for scrap but to set, restored as best the town's carpenter could manage, at the edge of the new schoolyard, a strange, silvered, dignified old thing, a monument to nothing anyone would call valuable by ordinary measure, and yet, as her grandmother had always insisted, a thing that had simply been waiting for 90 years, for someone willing to look twice. We began this story with a woman standing at an auctioneer's gavel, 34 years old, cast out, holding $9 and a deed nobody else wanted. We told you her name was Eleanor Calder Rourke, and we asked you to settle in and hear how she came to buy a ravine that everyone else in Larkspur Hollow had spent 90 years agreeing not to look at too closely. What she found there was never really about gold, though the gold mattered, and it was never really about vindicating a family name, though that mattered too. It was about the particular, quiet courage it takes to sit with a thing everyone else has already decided is worthless, and ask it, patiently, carefully, the way her mother taught her to pick out a bad seam and her grandmother taught her that nothing discarded is truly beyond looking at twice, what it might still have to say. Ezra Calder waited 90 years to be believed. It took a woman with nothing left to lose, and everything her family had taught her about patience, to finally listen. Thank you for spending this hour with Eleanor and with us. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it, and if you have a moment, we'd love for you to leave a comment below and tell us, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them and we love hearing where in the world you're joining us from. Until next time, stay close.